Thank you everyone for joining us. It's very much appreciated. This is the second in a series of webinars hosted by ABHI and the team at Highland Marketing, all under the banner of effective approaches to health tech marketing. We ran a session a couple of weeks ago, which gave a bit of a top level view about some of the tools and techniques you can utilize for marketing. And in the second session, we're going to be bringing in one of our members, C2AI, who are going to talk about some of their successes they've had, specifically on the Cheshire and Merseyside ICS region. And Mike from the Health Innovation Network is going to provide some perspectives about their role and how they work that bridge between industry and the NHS. But without stealing the thunder of Matthew, who's going to talk more detail about the structure of this, I'll just highlight that in terms of format, we'll be presenting an interview style conversation for the first half before opening up to reflections and questions. Whilst colleagues are speaking, if you just pop yourself on mute, do put any questions in the chat, and then once we've done the presentation session, we'll then open it up to verbal questions or any further questions. So please do continue to put those questions whilst we're talking, and we'll endeavour to get through them all. As I said, we are recording, so you'll get a copy of this shortly. And as I mentioned, this is a series of webinars that we're running. So if you have any ideas or with what you'd like to see in the future with this partnership with Highland Marketing, please do let us know. Matthew and I were kicking around a few ideas the other week, and we were thinking about possibly a session on what's the best way to approach journalists and what's the best way to sell your story. So maybe we could do an interview style session with a journalist. That might be one idea we could do for our next session. But if you've got anything that you think would be really helpful to utilize for your own marketing tools, then let us know and we can build that into the future agenda. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Matthew. I think you're going to run through some introductions and then do a bit of a Q&A with Mike and Mark. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, John. That's great. Just make sure everyone can hear me okay. So yeah, I'm Matthew Darcy. I'm a senior communications consultant with Highland Marketing. For those of you that don't know us, we're a specialist health tech agency. We've been shouting about and championing the cause of health tech for more than 20 years now as an agency, and it really is a great sector to work in. Today, we're bringing you a story that's really powerful of how one health tech company, in this case C2AI, has really spread innovation across an ICS and has also generated interest from across the NHS more widely too. It's a great example of a project where innovation has been used to address an unmet need, in this case around elective waiting lists, and how it's been used to help to identify those people on lists who are at high risk and who perhaps either need to be prioritised or who need to be supported in other ways to prevent their deterioration as they're waiting for surgery. We're going to be joined in a moment by Dr. Mark Ratnaraja, who's a practicing paediatrician and who is the UK Managing Director for C2AI. And we also have Mike Kenny, who is the Associate Director for Enterprise and Growth at Health Innovation Northwest Coast. And I think it's important to say we brought together the panel today based on the fact that there's been lots of elements of success that have gone into this project. At Highland Marketing, we've been very fortunate to support C2AI from a media perspective to help to really spread the word and get coverage for the great things that are being achieved in the region and more widely. But more than that, there's been lots of things that have gone into that, and part of that has been the role of the HIN, the Health Innovation Network. And so we'll go into how all those different areas have tied together. So just before we go any further, if you're not being interviewed, if you wouldn't mind just popping yourself off camera as well today, that'd be really appreciated. But just to do some brief introductions, Mark, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, please, and give a bit of background on yourself, that'd be appreciated.
Thank you, Matthew, and delighted to join the ABHI and Highland Marketing webinar. So yes, as Matthew said, I'm Mark Ratnaraja. I'm a paediatric intensivist by training, working in the NHS, and have been doing so for over 20 years. And I also support the work at C2AI, where I work very closely with clinical and operational colleagues, both at NHS Trusts, but more recently with integrated care boards, in support of things like elective recovery, as well as other opportunities where our data analytics can support democratization of information and, importantly, look at driving insight into innovation. Nice to meet you all.
And Mike, if you'd just like to introduce yourself as well, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Well, it's really great to be here. It really is my privilege. So I'm Mike Kenny. I am the Associate Director for Innovation and Industry Partnerships and the de facto Commercial Director here at the Health Innovation Northwest Coast. I also have a couple of other roles as well. There are 15 health innovation networks across the England geography, and I'm actually chair of the 15 commercial directors for the Health Innovation Network. And I also have a economic growth director role a couple of days a week with the Health Innovation Network central team. So a few hats there. I'm very much wearing the Northwest Coast hat here this morning. In terms of my background, I spent 20 plus years in the pharmaceutical industry before I came into the NHS 8 years ago now. So my time in the pharmaceutical industry was very much, well, multiple roles, but predominantly working in above brand partnerships with senior NHS managers and clinicians in multiple NHS organisations, and really that led me into the work that I do now. So the Health Innovation Networks were set up 10, 11, 12 years ago now, and our remit very much is around speeding up the access to innovations, the adoption and spread of innovations into the NHS. The NHS obviously is many thousands of organisations, and if you're a small place-based company, it's very difficult for you to help your innovation to be seen and therefore to be procured and purchased by NHS organisations. And the Health Innovation Network really works very hard to bridge the gap between companies like C2AI and also NHS organisations, so we can bring through the technologies that can really make a difference both to patients but also to the workforce.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. So just getting into a bit of the background to this, Mark, of course, C2AI has been working with the NHS for many years now, in fact, and this is the latest innovation in some ways that you've been delivering with the NHS. But if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of history about the company, what you do more widely, and how that's led to the creation of what is more of a proactive tool for elective waiting lists.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and we had been providing and still do provide risk-adjusted outcomes analytics, so quality assurance capabilities for NHS trusts, and certainly that has historically been where we've focused our attention. Our chief medical officer was audit czar for NHS England back in the 90s, and has very much been at the sort of tip of the spear with regards to looking at outcomes, quality improvement, variance to practice, and helping support innovation, particularly around healthcare quality. When COVID happened, we were actually asked by some of the trusts we were working with, could we repurpose some of that capability to better understand the needs of the patient whilst waiting on the waiting list? And of course, waiting lists were going up even before COVID struck, and that's really been also a catalyst for a whole raft of other events that have happened. But one of the phenomena that was noticed at that time was patients waiting for longer were not only experiencing the impacts of their underlying condition worsening whilst they were waiting, but also the impacts of their comorbidities. And therefore, clinical teams are asking us, how could we better understand that dynamic need of the patient, and how could we utilize technology to support clinicians who would otherwise have to have a very manual method of constant review of patients at scale with an imperfect set of data. And so we sort of set ourselves the task of trying to understand how we could use the technologies that we've developed over the last 20 years, using AI capabilities as well as large data sets and machine learning to essentially do that particular request. And we were very fortunate at that time to get some NHS England funding, which was supporting a sort of adopt and adapt strategy. And it's at that time we were introduced to what was then the AHSN, now Health Innovation Network Northwest Coast, essentially Mike's team, to help us sort of navigate how best to introduce a sort of new concept to not just one, but multiple trusts at the time. And because we were able to run a large scale trial across not just sort of one trust, but actually multiple trusts that included both district general hospitals as well as secondary, tertiary and quaternary teaching hospitals. It then supported a much broadly based evaluation, which we were supported again by the Health Innovation Network to better understand the use of the technology, working alongside clinical teams, but also to evolve that technology in order to be fit for purpose. And so there was very much a kind of two-way conversation around how the technology could be deployed, but also learning from clinical colleagues in terms of what they needed and adapting it over that period of time.
Sure. Okay. And I think that the term need there is quite important, Mark. Of course, you were responding to an unmet need, and some of the findings that you're talking about there, I'm familiar with, having had the fortune to help to communicate some of the good news out there of what you've been achieving. And I know that's touched on areas such as reduced A&E admissions, being able to effectively find those hidden high-risk patients that might otherwise be buried on waiting lists, and really giving surgeons and surgical teams that proactive tool that doesn't require them sifting through data from all sorts of different settings to arrive at an understanding of who is at risk on a list. But really, this is about responding to an unmet need. And I think, Mike, that's where the role of a HIN often comes in, is helping to align technology with unmet need. Tell us a little bit about that. From your point of view, how was C2AI's solution really helping with that unmet need? And how were you able to use that in conversations that you were having to help to start to spread this?
Yeah, sure. A really important point there around unmet need, Matthew, to be honest. I think it's fair to say that when health innovation networks became, organisations doing the work that we do, 10 plus years ago, I think it's fair to say our approach was slightly more gung-ho than it is now, where we intuitively, because of our sort of a helicopter view, if you like, of the innovation landscape, we could see solutions that we kind of strongly felt that our NHS organisations ought to be buying, and we were quite sort of maverick in trying to take those solutions through to our stakeholders in hospitals, provider collaboratives, ICSs, and so on. And the reality there is that what you need really it's a more refined approach from that than that. What we learned, in those first few years is the product-led approach is not the correct approach to engage, senior NHS managers and clinicians, directors of finance, and so on. And we learned quite quickly that actually, it's an unmet need. It's a problems-led approach that we actually, begin to gain traction with our NHS organisations. And that's very much, what we learned along the way, is that our best work would be done if we could really sort of engage with our NHS organisations, even help them sort of understand their own problems, and even if they brought them to us themselves, we'd help them understand those problems. And then it'd be quite a long time before we ever got into a conversation about how we might tackle that problem and start to think about solutions. And the reality is that as much as we're called health innovation networks, adoption and spread, so getting something to be procured and purchased and then implemented in a service or a pathway, it's very much a people game. 80% of the work that we do is not really around the innovations, it's very much around the people, it's around the workforce. So the NHS Constitution says that patients are at the heart of everything that we do. But the reality is that if you're doing anything different in the NHS, it's the workforce, it's the staff, it's the clinicians that get to experience that change first. And so it's absolutely crucial that when you're doing any kind of change or transformation, that you engage the staff, the workforce, the clinicians, at the first step, and not, as is often the case, when the big bang comes, when, the big system that gets switched on and everybody's expected to use it on day one. You've actually, created a real big problem for yourself then if you haven't actually engaged staff and brought them with you along the way. And it's said that it takes 17 years for something to become, an innovation to become business as usual in the NHS. I think it's a bit less than that now. It's probably around 12 years, but that's still far too long. Absolutely far too long, especially in a digital world. And I think that what we've found absolutely to be the right thing to do is to tackle the problems, be problem focused rather than solution focused. And if you think about there's quite genuine reasons for that inertia. You think about somebody training to be a nurse or a doctor. One of the very first things they get taught is do no harm. So that means that you're hardwired to basically do things the way you were taught, to do them well and to repeat them. And therefore it makes you very conservative and risk averse. Whenever you introduce, something new into a pathway or service, if you don't understand that and you don't enable the staff and the workforce around that service to to really understand the opportunity and to de-risk, to take the risk away from that, provide the assurance, work on the culture and behaviours, then it's going to be really hard to actually make the changes that you need to make. And we come to, the pandemic. We knew about Mark and his team, C2AI, well before the pandemic. Through what Mark said, they were a clinical audit company, and a really good one at that. The pandemic really did focus people's minds, and health innovation networks, because of our our position at the forefront of innovation. We can see what the art of the possible was. We found ourselves really sort of front of centre in trying to address an awful lot of the critical problems that we saw in the NHS at the time. And, a lot of our time was spent doing trying to source PPE, but also to make sure that, there were lots of unscrupulous operators that were trying to basically get the NHS to buy things that didn't exist at the time. And so health innovation networks really were essentially in trying to manage all of that noise. And we came through that, and we came to the recovery. And this is where we forged a really good relationship with C2AI over their elective recovery platform. During the pandemic, we found ourselves really closely associated with NHS regions, with the ICSs and the providers, and that sort of that line I talked about before about being solutions problems focused. We were responding to demands, signalled demands. So our NHS organisation were telling us what they needed help with, and there was nothing more urgent than to do something about the elective recovery. I'm going to be slightly oversimplistic, but if you can imagine, prior to the pandemic and prior to companies like C2AI, it's not exactly unusual for actual surgeons to spend time triaging their waiting lists, deciding who comes in and when they should come in, and sometimes that they were brought in pretty much chronological order from the time that they went on the waiting list, without any kind of sense of what would the morbidity of that patient be, what would the outcome of that operation be, if we didn't manage some of the risk factors. And I know Mark's probably going to talk a little bit more about that. And so what C2AI had was really a completely different approach to that kind of chronological order of bringing patients in for elective procedures. And that's that was the and the implication of surgeons actually doing manually reviewing patient records and trying to decide when they should list them and so on. Obviously all the time that a surgeon is spent doing that, they're not in the operating theatre, and therefore they're not helping to manage the elective backlog. So it was, as Mark said, necessity was the mother of all invention in this case, and we spent a lot of time with our senior NHS organisations in the regions, and also in our systems, in our ICSs, helping them understand this was a way in which they could tackle potentially elective backlog, and that actually doing more of the same, so getting more surgeons to spend more time reviewing manual patient notes and so on, to try and sort of schedule patients for surgery. That's a very NHS approach, and there's no way that could be allowed at this time. It's not sustainable, and it wouldn't solve the problem. So we worked really hard to help people see the opportunity of doing something different around the elective scheduling.
Sure, thank you, Mike. And I think to sum up, I think I might quote perhaps one of the lead clinicians that's been involved in this, and I think the words he uses is right patient, right place, right time. Really being able to very quickly understand which patients need to be seen and treated most urgently, those in greatest need, and that's been something that might be taken for granted perhaps, but actually is far harder to understand than we might consider, and of course that's changing now with the work that's happening in Cheshire and Merseyside and elsewhere as well, that you're doing. And I think it's important to note that, of course, you've had to work not in isolation on this, that this has been a collaborative approach, that there's been other technology providers involved in different aspects of this as well. Is that worth talking about a little bit, just to understand the complexities of how you've managed that?
Thanks, Matthew. And actually, to Mike's point, this is all about the people, and actually, trying to understand what the processes are, the culture, working with people, trying to deal with, maybe some of their original heuristics around how things should happen versus what can happen given the right sorts of technologies and capabilities. So bringing people along with you is an important part of that, and that's actually an integral part of the collaborative process. And ultimately, that leads to better solutioning, because then it becomes a two-way thing. It's not done unto people. Actually, it's a two-way discussion, and that leads on to refinement, greater enhancement of these innovations. And so that then led on to, actually, once you've got the data, once you understand this sort of shift from, a chronological basis for scheduling patients to one that includes patient needs and dynamic risk, because actually, nothing stands still. Patients, their needs change over time, either because of their intercurrent illness or the progression of their underlying condition. That then leads on, very naturally to the so what question. What can we then do about that? And, Mike's team were very helpful in bringing together multiple capabilities that were already working in that environment, but sort of saying, well, actually, this is potentially how this could all dovetail together, i.e. the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So one of the things that we did very quickly was to sort of move from just looking at risk stratification to actually how can we support patients that have been identified as high risk, if they have modifiable risk factors, in order to optimize their health ahead of surgery, such that when they do come to have their operation, they're in the best, fittest state they can be. The enhancement here was by actually using the data, we could target that to specific perioperative risks, rather than it being a sort of general health and well-being support system. And that was really the innovation here, where the combination of our technology around data analytics and insight, partnered with a company like Surgery Hero that's providing intensive remote health coaching, meant that actually we could be much more focused on the exact patient requirement ahead of their surgery. In this case, the consensus was around looking at patients who had increased risk of post-operative chest infection, in part because it's associated with extended lengths of stay, unplanned admissions to intensive care, sequelae of surgery, and also in some cases, but very rarely, post-operative mortality. And therefore, it was looked at as a kind of a main focus. We identified those patients at risk of or at increased risk of chest infection. We then worked very closely with the operation and clinical teams to set the thresholds at which those patients should be enrolled onto one of the rehabilitation programs, and then worked very closely with the operational teams in order to make sure that data got sent through with all the IG that was required in order to facilitate that, such that those patients were then invited to be onboarded onto a targeted rehabilitation program. The great thing about that is that all the way through that endeavour, we could then track the benefit to the patient in terms of their risk-adjusted outcomes afterwards, as well as the operational benefits. And it's important that we make sure that this is not just looking at the intervention group, that actually we're case matching those patients and looking at the control group as well, to basically ask the question, is this having a benefit, and for which groups of patients is it having a benefit? The culmination of that piece of work is that we've done probably close to about 500 patients that have been invited and gone through a rehabilitation program. About half of those have already had their operations, and we've been tracking the benefits of that. And in the intervention group, we haven't found any cases of a post-operative chest infection, and the eligibility criteria was greater than 5%, compared to the control group that have, and also have had sequelae of their surgery as well. One of the unexpected benefits of that piece of work was that actually it also reduced the length of stay, something like 4.2 days on average per patient. And there was about a 50% increase in patients converting from inpatient general anaesthetic through to day cases. Again, all of this has a sort of operational as well as a clinical benefit, both in terms of patient safety, but importantly, more efficient and effective use of the scarce resources that we have in the NHS, and ultimately, the scarcest of resources, which is the NHS pound. And so that data has been published. It was actually published last year at the World Congress for Rehabilitation, and we're working very closely with the University of Liverpool to make sure that actually, on an ongoing basis, we're continuing to evaluate the benefits of that. So what's nice about it was an introduction by the Health Innovation Network around how do we combine multiple entities all doing their own great work, but working collaboratively, but importantly working alongside NHS and operational colleagues to make sure that we can deliver something that is value enhancing.
Absolutely. And I think with that, I mean, clearly now there's been benefits realised as you described, Mark. But at the time, at the beginning of this, what you're selling really is something very new. This is about innovation. I'm sure many people who are listening to this might be in this situation where they have an innovation that can make a very significant difference. But that's outside of the norm. This is not selling widgets, I think, is perhaps one way to describe it. How do you overcome that sort of challenge? I think, Mike, it might be nice to come to you on that to see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's really important to explore this, because I kind of already talked about the fact that the system NHS is innately conservative, and that's that's the reason why the things take an awful long time, innovations take an awful long time for to become business as usual, because people do things the way that they were taught, and they want to manage risk within their practice, and of course we absolutely understand that. But the downside of that is that the longer something takes to become adopted and adapted into practice, into services and pathways, then the longer it takes for patients and workforce to leverage the benefit for that. And so health innovation networks have been critical in supporting, it's a journey that we go on with organisations when it comes to, basically trying to work together on finding a solution to a problem. And in this case, it was the elective recovery. I think, first of all, we are NHS organisations. I've got an NHS lanyard and an NHS email address, and straight away that's a barrier that's removed. I talked earlier on about we bridge the gap between the NHS and industry. We very much play the role of honest broker and critical friend. We're very happy to hold the hand of both the companies with the innovations, but also our NHS colleagues as well. And a lot of our work when it comes to implementation is around giving senior NHS people the confidence to make a decision, the confidence to invest time and effort into the implementation and of an innovation, or prior to that the development of a business case. We'll help write a business case that means that that innovation can be funded, and therefore it can be rolled out. And that's an important thing to understand about innovation in the NHS. The NHS is brilliant at buying things it's bought 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 times. It's a very slick machine, is procurement within the NHS. But when it's buying something for the first time, then inevitably it's not actually replacing something else at that point. It's paying for something new, at the same time as it's still paying for whatever came before it, and will continue to do so for some time. So for the NHS to buy something like this, for the first time or the 10th time, maybe even the 100th time, it always involves a business case. So that's another reason why adoption and spread from one successful implementation to another in another part of the NHS, it takes time, because for each of those early initial adoptions, it usually requires a business case. Again, it's to manage the risk, the financial risk, but also the clinical risk. One of the things that we've done with C2AI and other health innovation networks have done as well is that we've tried to inoculate the company against the constant request for pilots by investing in evaluation in what we saw as something that was critical for the NHS, regardless of the pandemic, actually. But it's critical and ought to be in place in the majority, if not all, of elective lists across the NHS. And one of the ways in which we've tried to provide strength to Mark and his team's arm is to do the evaluation work in multiple use cases, so that we can give Mark the information. It's independently delivered by ourselves and potentially third parties, but it gives Mark the chance to say, look, in this use case, this is how you implement the C2AI product. These are the kind of things that you need to understand. This is how much it costs. These are the sort of local hurdles that you need to go through, and therefore, provide a template for not just the implementation, for the development of a business case, which even has some, health economic data in there, which might describe, as Mark's alluded to, he talks about, reduced length of stay and so on and so forth. So the evaluations really flush that out and give companies like Mark's the opportunity to kind of say no to the pilot, and yes, we'll have a commercial conversation. So in summary, we do all of that engagement work, and a lot of that work is done without, Mark and his team in the room. We do the work, with Mark in person in those meetings, and we've been proud to do that. But obviously, where we've got something as important as elective recovery and an opportunity as great as what we believe that we have here with C2AI, we have to do a lot of work offline with those senior managers who may not necessarily say what they think in the meeting at the time, but they might do afterwards. And so we provide a lot of support, hand holding, and as I said before, it's a people game. 80% of our work is done at the people level, at the culture and behavioural level, and we're a network, so we know people, and it's about understanding who can influence the decision, the procurement, and then sort of working with them to help understand what their what their concerns, their fears might be, and try to inoculate against them. I think that's really important. I think also, it's worth us talking, spending a little bit of time thinking about, the process of adopting innovation. It's never as simple, as taking a point solution and dropping it into a service or a pathway. Whenever you do that, you actually have to change the whole pathway, and you have to change, and where people's behaviours have to change all the way along that pathway to accommodate the innovation and to get the most out of it. And so health innovation networks, we really understand this. We have our complex change model that we've applied in this case, and we continue to apply, where we've got situations like this where it's genuinely a new way of doing things, and that complex change model supports the transformation, the redevelopment of the service or the pathway, and all of the the culture and behavioural inputs that are required to do that. We provide a safe space for people to do some of their planning, some of their thinking, even some of their storming, always getting them to the point where they can move forward with the implementation. And it may feel like that's a long-winded approach to doing complex change, to doing implementation of things like the C2AI platforms and so on. But actually, we've proved it time and time again. Versus the big bang, switch it on a Monday and hope everyone's using it by Friday. They're never successful. And our approach, the approach we're talking about here, is actually the one that is most successful.
Sure, no, that's really useful, Mark. I think that just shows the value of working with him, and it's certainly not treating a health innovation as just a sales team, for example. But I think I'm conscious there's lots of questions being dropped in the chat, which is great. Please do keep those questions coming. We'll come to a Q&A shortly. But just before we do get there, just a couple more questions really to wrap up the interview. I mentioned towards the beginning of this, we've been very fortunate as Highland Marketing to support C2AI and the Cheshire and Merseyside region on some of the communications around the work that's being achieved. There's been quite a lot of media coverage as a result of that across national newspapers, in trade press such as Health Service Journal repeatedly, and it's been a great from a story to work with and to keep working with, really, because there's lots of components there, from the evidence through to the human story, through to many other things that have made this really work. Mark, what's your perception of the importance of that media work, perhaps as means to reinforce the work you're doing with a HIN, or perhaps reinforce and justify the work that's happening in the region, to really put your customer in the spotlight and celebrate their success?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. As Mike sort of said, the challenge here is trying to shift cultural heuristics, and you have to take people along with you, and ultimately you can only do that through communication. And ultimately we've all got our heads down and we're doing our bit as diligently as we can do, and that includes operational and clinical colleagues, and very rarely do we get the time or the space to stick our head above the parapet and sort of see what else is out there. So being able to communicate, and people really respond to stories of the so what, actually what's the end benefit here. It's not really about the technology, it's about the needs being met, and in how that's been done, and ultimately where is the patient benefit, and where is how are we alleviating the pressure for clinical clinical colleagues such that they're not getting burnt out and such that they are seeing utility in these sorts of insights. And really being able to articulate that is a great skill, one that I'm learning. But this is where you need help. This is where you need help from the Health Innovation Network. This is where you need help from the likes of Highland Marketing, people who can articulate these sorts of stories and put it in a context that people can understand and sort of maybe reflect on their own clinical practice and sort of see the applicability. So it's absolutely vital. We are always trying to tell the story of, the so what question. How does this work in your context? And ultimately, that sometimes means doing it in a new environment or doing it for a particular type of specialty. But sometimes it means actually, what's it, where is the patient benefited in this? And actually being able to see that sort of soup to nuts pathway and ultimately where it ends. And sort of seeing that actually this is really about how we can, benefit the patient, so that ultimately we're getting the best outcome for our patients, and ultimately, driving creating the pathways that, then sort of best befit that is the kind of key critical question. And ultimately, innovation requires education of the market, and therefore this is an important part of selling that story.
Absolutely, that's great, Mark. I think I might just wrap up with one final question, and please, Mark, please both give your view on this. But of course, you've now got ICS-wide success to a degree on this, Mark. There's still a journey to go on that. In terms of your wider rollout across the Cheshire and Merseyside region. However, you've got an ICS-wide contracts in place, and you've also got significant interest nationally, of course, as well as also having customers in other parts of the country that are doing similar things now. What would you summarise as being the key factors that have led to this level of success?
So in my view, and this has been mentioned already, I think there are sort of four things. So one is you need to bring clinical and operational colleagues with you at the earliest stage possible. As Mike said, you can't just drop an innovation on someone and expect it to work. You've got to win hearts and minds, and people have got to see that actually this is going to benefit them, and they can sort of wrap their hands around it and kind of really get an understanding of what this means to them. The second is that you need clinical leadership. You need an ambassador. You need people at the executive level that kind of see the vision, that see the strategy, and actually create the space to make this happen. Sometimes that's about resource. Sometimes that's about time, sometimes that's about funding, but ultimately you need senior colleagues, whether that be at the C-suite level or whether that be at an ICB level, to basically sort of say, this is the direction of travel we want to take our organisation. This is something worth investing time and effort in, and we're going to hold you to account, both internally but also as us as suppliers, to make sure that we're delivering on that. The third is that you need to have the right support network, and this is where Mike's team at the Health Innovation Network are absolutely vital, because you only have a certain span of control, and therefore you need to understand the political landscape, who it is within the organisations that you need to win over and talk to, and make sure that you understand that actually the key stakeholder framework, and who needs to get involved, and how can that best be supported from the hearts and minds. It's the off-site conversation that Mike was alluding to that actually sometimes is the thing that really gets you over the line, above and beyond. And then lastly, you need to make sure that actually you're doing things in a commercial and in an efficacious way. So that is making sure you tick all the boxes from an information governance and patient safety perspective. You're doing it from the perspective of gathering the evidence, in terms of being able to demonstrate return on investment, because ultimately that's how decisions are going to be made in terms of that scarce resource. How do we best spend the NHS pound? How can we make sure we do something better and cheaper, and being able to prove that and accumulate that evidence along the way is a vital part of that. And again, this is where the Health Innovation Network has been really helpful in providing that dispassionate third-party validation of that work. So you need all of those ingredients to make that work, because ultimately you're educating the market. As Mike said, there isn't a sort of nice framework where you can just drop yourselves in. Over time that comes, but when you're starting off, that's a critical part of it.
Absolutely. I think you've given us lots there, Mark. Mike, just to sum up in 60 seconds, just before we move on to questions, what would be your view on that?
Yeah, I'm going to emphasise the importance of senior buy-in from both clinical and managerial. I think we should mention Professor Rowan Pritchard Jones. He's the medical director for Cheshire and Mersey ICS. He's a maxillofacial surgeon who's done, spent time in war theatres and so on. He really got this. He really got the opportunity, and he's really helped. Mark works for the company, so he's not credible in the eyes of some clinicians whom you're asking to do something different. I'm not a clinician, so I'm not credible either. But Rowan Pritchard Jones is a surgeon, so he can help surgeons, his fellow surgeons, see the opportunity here, and maybe give them sort of the air cover to think differently, to do something differently. So that senior managerial and clinical buy-in is absolutely vital. I think I really want to emphasise this point as well, which is that companies like C2AI, they make their own luck. So Mark and his team, there's no secret to success here. It's very much about elbow grease and shoe leather. Mark and his team have been tireless. They've been professional, respectful. They've worked all the channels. They've taken all the opportunities from not just the Health Innovation Network, but they've taken all the opportunities that have helped them take, the next step and the next step and the next step. And so there are companies that don't understand that. They don't appreciate that. They kind of think, oh, we've got this product and it works. Why doesn't the NHS buy it? Mark and his team understand that totally. That's not the way to be successful. It's hard work and diligence and working out who can help you on your journey. I think two very more quick points about what the Health Innovation Network can bring. Always the first question I ask when somebody says, what have you got that will solve this? My question is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Start the conversation there, never with the product. And then finally, I think, what else do HINS provide? In this case and in many others as well, we've provided bandwidth, for really busy people, both clinicians and managers in the NHS who barely can look up. They don't have time to go for lunch. So how can they possibly take on a transformation product as significant as this? But that's what Health Innovation Networks do. We give people bandwidth, and the courage to kind of to do things differently, to take those important steps.
Thank you, Mike. John, back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. I think that was a fantastic example of a great idea with utilizing the resource that's at hand. I think Mike's points around enabling that headspace for innovation within the system, I think, is a really important one and an important factor in why the HINS exist, in fact. So great to hear that support. So loads of great questions that are coming. We'll try and get through all of them if we can in time. I'll go chronologically. Great question here from Lisa. I appreciate this. This may be a bit of a how long's a piece of string question, Mike, but let's assume a company has got a solid regulatory pathway. They understand the clinical need. Can you give an indication on the typical cycle time from discussing that unmet need through to actually getting a project underway? As I said, I appreciate you can't give a categorical answer to this, but it might be just useful to give a realistic expectations for companies who might be undertaking a journey like Mark said.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think I kind of, it's kind of some of what I was alluding to in my previous comments about, how hard the companies have got to work. I think, when I talk about, innovation, and companies that, have got things that the NHS, ought to be buying, and we work with them on that. I talk about us going on a journey with those companies. I don't actually think our work with Mark will ever be done. It may be in time, but I think that we go on a journey where we've got something that is so critical to, in this case, elective recovery. Health Innovation Networks go on a journey. If you think about, where we've been 3 years at this, since the sort of middle of the pandemic to where we are now, we've been 3 years at this. And you know, that's probably not, I wouldn't say that's a longer period of time than it would normally take to kind of get to the point where I think, you know, C2AI and their products are you know, they're at a tipping point for scale. You know, we've proven that in Cheshire and Mersey, we've had to take time to do that. You know, win the battle of hearts and minds, leverage the air cover that, you know, the medical director provided, and so on. Do the evaluation work. That's taken 2 years. And it's led to, you know, the initial you know, trusts that took this on, and it spread to all of the trusts in the ICS. And whilst we've been sort of you know, whilst that's been happening, I've been working, you know, we're a network, there are 15 of us, so I've been talking to all of my colleagues in the other 14 health innovation networks, because they've got challenges with elective recovery as well. And so what we've done, you know, again, working with Mark on that, is again, where demand has been signalled, you know, where, you know, the local systems to the other health innovation networks have expressed look, you know, we need to find another way to do elective recovery. Have you got anything that can help? You know, that's led to me having conversations, you know, with my colleagues in other health innovation networks, which has led to us bringing, you know, Mark and his team into conversations with those health innovation networks, and then into the systems, and then into the providers, and you've got that kind of organic growth into other parts of the country. You know, what we've been really sort of keen to try and support, and we do this with all innovators, is, you know, give them a platform so they don't have to do pilots unnecessarily. You know, if they've got a use case, it's been proven, and we know how it's been implemented, and we've got evaluation data and so on and so forth, then, you know, the time for, you know, we shouldn't be really getting into a situation where we're piloting a technology. You know, we should be getting into the situation where we're procuring a technology. Easier said than done, because, you know, for all the reasons we've discussed about, but you know, having, you know, one health innovation network, then 2, then 3, then 4. You know, that's how, you know, we found that we can, you know, it's Mark that's doing the work. You know, let me say that. You know, we'll help with the implementation. We might help with the development of a business case in you know, in a new area, in a new ICS, and so on. But it's Mark and his team that do the work of implementation, and that's really important. So in terms of how long it takes, you know, as I said, I'm not sure our journey will ever be finished with C2AI, and I don't want it to be honest, if I'm being perfectly honest. But in terms of, I think, where, you know, we've got to with Mark, where he's, you know, almost, you know, the blue touch paper has been lit. People now get what the premise here is and the need for it and how to do it. You know, that's 3 or 4 years hard work, mostly from Mark and his team, but with an awful lot of support from myself, my team, and colleagues across the Health Innovation Network.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Mike. And I suppose, Matthew, that's an area where marketing and sharing success stories plays a part, doesn't it? Because you're constantly making noise about a business and helping them open some of those doors as well. Question here around funding. So let's discount private funding for a moment. How can medical advisors get funding to start some of these projects? Maybe again, Mike, NIHR funding, Innovate UK, SBRI. Is there any way you could point companies towards?
Yeah, so again, you know, that's something that we do. We kind of keep our ear to the ground with all kinds of funding opportunities, and also, you know, recognition opportunities. I think, you know, and maybe Mark can talk to that. So, you know, access to finance is something that, you know, all health innovation networks support. We both, you know, we support access to both grant funding, but also, you know, commercial funding, venture capital, private equity, and so on and so forth. Because we recognise that, you know, one of my I get commissioned by the Office for Life Sciences to do everything that we've been talking about here. But one of the outcomes that they want to see, alongside, you know, impact on patients, is economic growth, and that, to you or me, is, you know, is inward investment and it's job creation. So if companies like C2AI, you know, can get over the line, can be procured and commissioned and implemented, then they stand a chance of being able to grow, to be able to recruit more highly skilled staff. And there's a huge benefit in terms of population health, because wealth, you know, and health are very, very closely associated with each other. So yeah, health innovation networks, you know, really do work hard with organisations who we have a strong sense have got something that the NHS, you know, ought to be buying or needs, you know, meets unmet need and signal demand. You know, we'll really work really hard to find the grant funding opportunities and support those companies to access those grant funding opportunities and to be successful in doing that. We'll even, you know, with SBRI Healthcare, for example, you know, we even have a chance to shape those calls. so that, again, we're meeting, the demand that's being signalled, and we're encouraging, innovators and companies to develop stuff that actually is needed. I've seen all too many times, people out of the goodness of their hearts have tried to invent things, from a very personal experience, but they haven't done the due diligence that you ought to do. Is it needed? How big is the market opportunity? We can support all of that. And also, it's not just about finding the funding sources. We don't write the bids. I think the companies have got to write the bids. That's absolutely. But we will get our sleeves rolled up and help with that. We'll help with reviewing the bids before they go in. And also, quite a lot of bids have a second stage. They have an interview stage or a panel stage. And we all of the health innovation networks. We support companies to basically face those panels. We'll do pitch coaching. Quite often those panels, it's the company plus an NHS person that's representing the bid, and again, we support our NHS colleagues with those bids. So yeah, it's something that I would quite confidently say that we do make the difference when it comes to the success from a company that works with the Health Innovation Network on their bid versus a company that doesn't.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Mike. Mark, I'm going to try and give him time. I'll try and wrap a few questions up into one, so bear with me. So you mentioned around some of your lessons and tips, around securing senior buy-in, ensuring that you are a serious business, you've got your information governance and things like that in place, and a degree of educating the market, which I think was a nice turn of phrase. So just looking at access, there's a question around what's a real game changer for you guys in terms of accessing the right decision makers for C2AI at an ICS level. First point of the question, and then how did you actually persuade those people to invest? What was that business case process for you?
Yeah, it's not a simple response to that, unfortunately, Jonathan, as you can imagine. But just reflecting a little bit on Mike saying, the lifeblood of all of this is being able to get funding, because unfortunately, unless you can kind of keep the lights on and keep the innovation development and the people that you need to do it, it becomes very difficult. And the reality is if you're operating in an environment where there isn't a traditional funding source, or as is the case at the moment, the NHS is severely cash strapped and innovation isn't necessarily front of people's minds because they're paying salaries, they're paying for dealing with strikes and various other things, it becomes a really big challenge. And one of the things that the Health Innovation Network has been really helpful to us is actually just identifying the funding sources. Sometimes you get calls for funds that you weren't aware of, that just coming out of the blue, and you've got a short period of time with which to respond to them. Actually just being made aware that those have been called out, and they may be in a forum or a portal that you're not on or aware of, is actually something that's incredibly useful, and therefore being able to react to it appropriately is also very useful as well. Being able to secure some of that funding and prove the case, even if it's in a small scale with one trust or one department or even one clinician, is vitally important, because that's how you start to scale up. And what's been really helpful is that we've tried to do both of those things. So the bottom-up model, where you're working directly with clinical teams, departments, in some cases individual trusts, and also the top-down, where you get funding to do multiple sites and so on. And of course, we've been living in an environment where the goalposts have been changing. ICSs didn't exist a couple of years ago. They've been created, and they're only starting now to mature and develop their own sense of purpose and strategy. And so being able to navigate those rocky shores of how the influence of the ICSs on the trusts and backup is kind of trying to navigate that requires help, and that's ultimately where the Health Innovation Network can be really, really helpful. But my advice is, start small, make sure you're paid for it, and make sure that you can keep the lights on, because ultimately, if you can prove the case, even in terms of a small pilot, you can then scale that up, and then you can move on to then looking at that at a larger scale, whether that be a department or whether that be a trust. And that in itself attracts interest in terms of how you can then, and other sources of funding that you can then do. So it does require a top-down and bottom-up model. The top-down need to see the proof of concept, and that actually you've got proof of deployment. And actually, as you start to do that, you then start to iterate, the basic things like IG documentation, making sure that you've got the right types of tick boxes, whether it be DCB 129 or whether it be working towards medical device registration. Ultimately, you're starting to collate the sort of portfolio of materials that you require that then get you to the stage that actually when you're moving into a new area or a new market, you can say, look, I've got all the resources, I've got all the independent validation, I've got the return on investment and business case. Actually, you've almost got the templates to then say this is about a cookie cutter approach that you're going to apply to another site. That takes time to develop, and you've got to be able to do that in a deliberated, thoughtful way that brings people along with you, but also ticks all the relevant bits of evidence that you need, whether that be a DTAC or a DCB 129 or medical device registration or independent validation and so on. You then have to be very reactive to the funding sources, and so you're always running this very delicate dance between the process versus where you get the funding from. Ultimately, you want to get to the stage where actually it does become part of BAU, and actually by influencing the market in that way, you can then start to have conversations about being on a framework and being able to be procured as a not a commoditized, but as something that people recognize as an established product and service.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And recognition here in the comments around making sure you're paid for it and setting the right parameters for engaging. So that's great feedback. Thank you, Mike. I'll wrap up a couple of just practical questions for you about engaging with the HINs. So first one here, general advice. Would you recommend companies actually just go to yourselves as a HIN or go to the trust first? And then secondly, what's the role of the HINs in actually helping to scale innovations nationally where they do meet a national lead?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, basically, we've all got front doors. If you've accessed one of us, you basically, you're accessing all of us. There is the NHS Innovation Service. That is a route that you can choose, and you'll get allocated to one of the health innovation networks if you're asking for health innovation network support. But I'd always, I'd talk to your local health innovation network in the first instance before you did anything else. We kind of, we know our local markets. It just makes sense geographically, to speak to your local health innovation network. We've got a company engagement form, so we'll ask you to fill out one of those. Just gives us, essential information that makes the first conversation that we have with you, that first meeting, just much more meaningful. It helps us understand your value proposition, what stage your company's at, and so on and so forth, what stage your innovation's at. So yeah, I think always don't be shy. Talk to us first. That would be my big recommendation. I think the other point there about sort of national scale. I live in Preston. I'm sat here in our offices in Warrington at the moment. If something works well in Warrington or Preston, it's going to work well in the northeast in Newcastle. It's going to work in Croydon. It's going to work in Cornwall. Might need a little adaptation here and there, but the NHS is quite parochial. I mean, I'm very proud to work for the NHS, but I also, finding myself smiling wryly that, there's quite a lot of not made here. Just because it works over there doesn't mean it'll work here. And that's for something that the health innovation networks, have become, so much better at helping overcome. The fact there are 15 of us, we cover all of the England geography. To the point, if something, that we're seeing it with Mark and C2AI and their PTL product, we've shown it can work here in Cheshire and Mersey, and that's given others the confidence to be followers, to have the conversations and be engaged. It's our job to do that. It's always been the challenge of trying to spread, innovation that's worked from one place to another. Well, that's our job to do that, and we make sure it does happen. I think just to also say, that we also have access to and can help people. There are multiple programs of support. So there is the Accelerated Access Collaborative, who have multiple programs of support, from clinical entrepreneur programs for aspiring inventors, innovators. The National Innovation Accelerator program. I've talked about SBRI Healthcare as a funding opportunity for scale up. There are national programs that health innovation networks can influence. So for MedTech, there's the MedTech EdTech funding mandate, which is where products that have got an evidence base that meet unmet need, that can have impact, can be supported centrally, but also by all 15 health innovation networks. So it's not just us kind of doing the treading of the boards to drive adoption and spread. We can support access to some of those levers that can help with market access on a wider basis.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I suspect this conversation could go well beyond the hour, but we are, alas, at the hour. So I just want to reiterate your thanks for sharing those insights, and I hope that's been a really useful session for the delegates on the line, getting some good feedback in. So thank you for that. We have recorded the session. I know we weren't able to get to all of those questions, but when we send around the recording, we'll include Mark and Mike and Matthew's emails in that. So please do continue those conversations. All colleagues online have indicated they'd be very happy to discuss any of those elements with you. I said we'll get this recording with you shortly. And if there's any ideas you'd like for our next session with Highland Marketing around how you can successfully utilize marketing as part of your go-to-market and expansion strategy, then let us know. We'd love to put on a session that's been informed by yourselves. So we are bang on 12 o'clock, so we better wrap up there. But a big thanks again to Matthew, Mike, and Mark for joining us today. The recording will be with you shortly, but just leaves us to say thank you and have a great afternoon.